After World War II and the decolonization of the Middle East that occurred, Arab people across the region began to dream of a united Arab nation, which could finally be strong enough to choose its own destiny. This belief in pan-Arab state is called Baathism, which gained a special prominence in Syria and Iraq. Baathists were generally leftists who supported certain socialist ideas, such as collective agriculture, which made them a threat to the US as a potential point of communist takeover. This same pan-Arabian sentiment existed in Egypt as well, although followers there believed in the slightly different belief of Nasserism, that any united pan-Arab state should rightfully be controlled from the capital in Cairo. President Nasser of Egypt successfully pressured Syria to join them in 1958 to start a united Arab republic, with hopes that the rest of the world would soon join in. Instead, in response, the countries of Jordan and Iraq quickly formed their own union, the Arab Federation. The union arose from the fact that King Hussein of Jordan and King Faisal II of Iraq were cousins and both part of the powerful Hashemite royal family who had overseen managing Mecca for outside occupying powers since the year 958 and for the Ottomans since the 1500s. Starting in the beginning of the 1900s, a movement began in Anatolia called the Young Turks, who advocated for the end of the Ottoman Empire in favor of a nationalist Turkish state, which then, in consequence, weakened the Ottoman Empire. So during World War I, the British effectively convinced the Hashemites to fight against the Ottomans in the Arab Revolt with the promise of governance following the war. This was granted, and the Hashemites were able to control Iraq for 4 decades and still continue to control the Kingdom of Jordan until today. However, the Hashemite Arab Federation did not last long, as on July 14, 1958, a coup occurred in Iraq which overthrew and executed King Faisal II and founded a republic. This republic did not last long, as another coup occurred a couple years later in 1963, when the Ba'ath Party, who was sharing power with other groups, seized absolute control in the Ramadan Revolution. By November of that year, Nasser and his allies were able to instigate another coup, putting a Nasserist in power in Iraq. The Nasserist government had used the chaos of the Six-Day War to try and nationalize the Iraq Petroleum Company, which had been owned by English, Dutch, and French financiers. At this point, the US believed it was going to be able to convince the Nasserists to return the oil infrastructure back to the firms which financed them. This hope was crushed by yet another Ba'athist coup in 1968, which initially saw General Hassam al-Bakr as the regime's first leader, who was eventually succeeded by his Vice President Saddam Hussein. In 1963, coinciding with the Ramadan Revolution in Iraq, a Ba'athist coup occurred in Syria, which saw many high-ranking officials executed and replaced with Alawite army leaders. The Alawites are an ethno-religious offshoot from Shiite Islam, similar to how Mormonism is for Protestant Christianity, and they now live in northwestern Syria. While a majority of Syria is Sunni Muslim, being 74% of the population, the Shia Alawites make up a considerable minority at 13% and had historically held strong positions in the Syrian military. This new Alawite government looked to suppress the Sunni masses and promote their secular vision for the state. Sensing a lack of progress on this goal, Hafez al-Assad, a key player in the coup, instigated his own coup in 1970 known as the Corrective Movement. Assad aimed to unite the Arab world around a common hatred of Israel and a desire for closer ties to the Soviet Union. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, under President Richard Nixon, sought to counter this Soviet push in the Middle East by fracturing relationships between the Arab states to stop a united Arab nation. Kissinger's strategy succeeded to breaking the alliance between Egypt and Syria when he convinced Anwar Sadat of Egypt to sign a separate peace treaty with Israel at the 1978 Camp David Accords, sidelining Assad. Enraged, Assad promised to bring fury to America and the West for meddling with Arab sovereignty. The split into Islam into Sunni and Shia camps began in year 632 at the death of Muhammad. In the wake of his death, Muhammad's followers set up a governance system for territory belonging to followers of Islam called a caliphate. The caliphate would be ruled by a caliph who would act as leader of the Islamic world. However, his followers could not decide who the rightful heir of the throne was. On one side, the Sunnis believed that Abu Bakr, a close follower of Muhammad's teachings, should be his natural successor due to his commitment to the faith of Islam. On the other hand, the Shia believed Ali, who was also a founder of Muhammad, should be the successor because he had directly related to Muhammad as his cousin. This disagreement caused a civil war, with the first caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, being controlled by the Sunnis. The Sunni forces pushed north and invaded and conquered Persia, where many of the followers of Ali persisted. A civil war broke out between Shia and Sunnis, and Ali was able to secure power as the new caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate. His reign ended in the year 661, however, after the Umayyad Caliphate overthrew the Rashidun and installed a hereditary monarchy. Over time, most of the Arab and Turkish worlds adopted Sunni Islam, while Persian areas adopted Shia Islam. By 1979, while most of the Arab world was continuing to be ruled by authoritarian dictators or kings, the Ayatollah overthrew the Shah in the Iranian Revolution and established a Shia Islamic Republic. The start of the Iran-Iraq War the following year looked to be almost certain doom for the Iranian Republic, who were vastly outgunned by Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime. Ayatollah Khomeini came up with the idea of recruiting unarmed boys to use as martyrs on the battlefield by walking them through minefields and blowing themselves up to allow free passage of the Iranian military. Within the Quran, suicide is strictly forbidden as a sin in Islam. Followers of Shia Islam began a tradition of ceremonial self-whipping that represented the injustice that their leader Ali faced in his lifetime, which eventually culminated in his assassination by Umayyad conspirators. Khomeini was able to frame this organized suicide of young boys instead as the holiest of acts for Islam, self-sacrificing oneself on the battlefield for self-punishment, to honor Ali and to please Allah. Monuments were erected all over Iran, celebrating the braveness of the children who were coerced into an untimely death. The use of children essentially as human bombs stung the Iraqis and stopped them from securing an outright victory. The use of humans as bombs caught the attention of President Assad of Syria, who became interested in using it as a weapon against the Israelis and the Americans, who were their enablers. In 1982, Israel's ally and the Maronite Christians won control of Lebanon and installed the Western-backed leader Bakir JML. JML led Lebanon for only 23 days, being assassinated by a Syrian nationalist operating in Lebanon. The assassination prompted the Maronites to seek a revenge attack on the Muslims, who then massacred innocent civilians, killing over 2,000 Palestinian refugees. The massacre created global outrage against the Maronites, with President Ronald Reagan deciding to send U.S. Marines to Lebanon to stop further massacres from spiraling out of control into genocide. Assad saw the introduction of U.S. Marines in Lebanon as a confrontation to his regime, and he began to fund and manipulate the Shiite extremists operating out of Lebanon, known as Hezbollah, to begin to carry out suicide bombing attacks. In 1983, Hezbollah militants suicide bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, including 17 Marines. The U.S., also shocked and afraid of the unknown capabilities of a force willing to commit suicide for victory, packed up the Marines and left Lebanon, dealing a win to Assad. In Hafez al-Assad's short-sighted lust for revenge, he failed to fully consider the risks of unleashing the concept of suicide bombing to the Islamic world, or the possibility that this behavior could jump from Shiite sects to the much larger Sunni sects. Since the early 1900s, the Muslim Brotherhood was active in Egypt and was popular across the Arab world, with the sole goal of establishing a Sunni Islamic state, although mainly through peaceful popular sovereignty means. This goal of unity served an alternative to an Arab world united by nationalism, and to some even had ambitions of a united Muslim world. This idea caught on with Osama bin Laden, the son of a wealthy Saudi businessman. Bin Laden used the resources at his disposal to train and amass an Islamic jihad force known as Al-Qaeda, with their first mission being to expel a Soviet invasion on the Islamic world in the mountains of Afghanistan. Afghanistan as an entity originated out of the Durrani Empire, a Sunni empire based in Afghanistan, whose territory covered Pakistan and the Punjab and Kashmir regions of India. Durrani power began to wane in the late 1700s, with the Afghans losing their empire status in 1823, following loss of their possessions to the Sikh Empire. The Afghans remained loosely aligned, although throughout the 1800s were governed by three different emirates, the Muslim political administration level that is below a caliphate. They were the emirates of Kabul, Herat, and Kandahar. In 1926, Kabul, the most powerful of the emirates, sought to modernize and strengthen the country by forming a unified monarchy. The goals for liberal reforms were rejected by the conservative Muslim tribes in the remote mountainous regions of the country known as the Sakoists. In 1928, the Afghan Civil War broke out between the Sakoists and the monarchists, with the monarchists ultimately prevailing, leading to the establishment of the Kingdom of Afghanistan. For most of its existence, the Afghan king was Muhammad Zahir Shah, who ruled from 1933 until a coup by his cousin toppled him in 1973. His cousin, Muhammad Dawood Khan, had a military background and had previously served as prime minister before having a fallout with the king. He took the opportunity of a failed legislative reform and the king's vacation to Italy to seize control of Afghanistan and proclaim a republic ruled by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Daoud Khan sought to modernize Afghanistan by promoting secularism and an aggressive foreign policy abroad, particularly against Pakistan, who had a sizable Pashtun minority, to quote unquote liberate them. Lack of quick reform and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of a PDPA leader caused the PDPA to split into two factions. The Parkam, which were more conservative, moderate socialists who believed in collectivization but opposed the idea of the state getting between the people and their religion, Islam. And then there was the Khalq, which was the more radical left-wing bloc who wished to completely transform Afghanistan into a secular communist state. In 1978, the Khalq bloc of the PDPA instigated a socialist coup against Daoud Khan, murdering him and his family in an event called the Sour Revolution. The Khalq slowly pushed the Parkam representation out of the legislative body and began to instigate socialist reforms, which were violently carried out. The Khalq began to remove Islamic symbols and remove restrictions on women's rights. This angered the more conservative, moderate Parkam, who began to being pushed out of the government, were now in the opposition. Violence broke out between the Parkam and the Khalq in charge, who quickly requested outside support from the Soviet Union to help the Parkam from toppling their new communist state. Expecting a swift victory and the reinforcement of Khalq rule, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviets were encouraged to get involved out of a fear that in replacement of a communist Afghanistan would be an Islamic republic similar to the newly formed one in Iran, and would then have the revolution spread to the Soviet Central Asian socialist republics, an almost exact mirroring of the fears held by the Democrats in the US of the domino theory of communism. The communists were now beginning to consolidate within large cities, especially Kabul, so it was the Soviets' goal of reaching Kabul and reinforcing it. They made several tactical errors, however, with the most glaring being to choose to invade on the last day of October, heading into a brutally cold winter. Pakistan quickly grew alarmed not only about their own Pashtun separatist issue, but now over the possibility of their sovereignty being steamrolled by the Soviet war machine. Pakistan called on their allies, the US and China, to begin funding Islamic freedom fighters called Mujahideen from within Afghanistan and abroad. Al-Qaeda was one of these groups that received funding from the US. The jihad of the Mujahideen against the Soviets was successful, and after a 10-year war, they were finally pushed out back to Russia. Shortly after, the Soviet Union would collapse, with the failure in Afghanistan being one of the many potential causes. Ecstatic over their victory, the Al-Qaeda left Afghanistan and returned home to Saudi Arabia, eager to continue their righteous campaign. Soon, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the ensuing Gulf War would destabilize the region. Saudi Arabia sought military assistance to help support the Kuwaiti allies, as well as their own borders and oil infrastructure. Osama bin Laden offered up the support of al-Qaeda to help protect national security, but his offer was rebuffed by the Saudi government, who instead chose to allow the United States to operate within Saudi Arabia. This infuriated bin Laden, who believed it was illegal for any non-Muslim to step foot in Saudi Arabia. Further, the U.S.'s refusal to continue to arm al-Qaeda and their campaigns in Arab East Africa made him realize that he was just a pawn in the world geopolitical game and only was ever helped of American interests to beat the Soviets, not to encourage Islamic self-rule. So bin Laden's continued protests led to his exile from Saudi Arabia. He relocated to Afghanistan, where the new Islamic government of the Taliban welcomed him and allowed him to recruit and train al-Qaeda fighters within their borders as a thank you for their help in the Soviet-Afghan War. In addition to their East African campaigns, al-Qaeda planned an attack on the U.S. for their support of Israel and their transgressions in the Middle East. In 1993, al-Qaeda member Ramzi Youssef was tasked with parking a van filled with explosives at the base of the World Trade Center's North Tower in New York City to detonate and topple the tower, causing it to fall over and knock the South Tower over. The bombing claimed the lives of 7 people, but failed to topple the towers. Drawing inspiration from the recent emergence of Islamic suicide bombing, he took the Shiite tradition and applied it to radical Islam. Al-Qaeda again tried to attack America with this new strategy. In 1995, in the Bojinka plot, where the terrorists planned to hijack 11 international flights originating from the U.S. and to blow them up mid-air, as well as crash one of the jets into the CIA headquarters. The plan was thankfully thwarted, and Youssef was caught and imprisoned for life. The plan's failure embarrassed bin Laden and furthered his obsession to interfere with American life like they did with the Middle East. Back to the drawing board, he planned a much more ambitious attack on America that would take several years of planning and training of jihadists to achieve. Initially, core Al Qaeda operatives were handpicked by bin Laden to relocate to San Diego, learn to fly a plane, and then carry out the attacks. This initial push, however, did not work as the operatives did not speak English and their flying skills turned out to be poor. Bin Laden then chose men from a small Sunni jihadist cell located in Hamburg, Germany, to carry out the attack. These men were educated, knew English, and also had experience living and blending in with Western culture. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 4 Boeing passenger jets were hijacked by the terrorists using box cutters and fake bombs as tools to cause panic and subdue the passengers. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston at 7:59 a.m. and crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. United Flight 175 departed Boston at 8:14 a.m. and crashed into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Flight 77 departed Washington, D.C. at 8:20 a.m. and crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. The final flight, United Flight 93, departed Newark at 8:42 a.m. and was intended to be crashed into the U.S. Capitol. However, the plane never made it to its intended target because the passengers became aware that the terrorists were not armed and began to fight back. Unfortunately, this was too late, and they were unable to stop the plane from nosediving into a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board. These sites were chosen because of their symbolism to Americans. The World Trade Center represented global capitalism, something bin Laden despised, and he was also eager to see it collapse after the previous failed attempt. The Pentagon and the Capitol were chosen in retaliation against the U.S. government for their interference in the Middle East. In the end, 2,977 people were killed in the attacks. The attacks on 9/11 deeply shocked Americans and left a deep wound. Country singer Alan Jackson summed up the average reaction in his song, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning, where he writes, "I'm not a real political man. I watch CNN, but I'm not sure I can tell you the difference between Iraq and Iran." The size and safety of the U.S. far away from the troubles of Eurasia shields its people and lets American citizens, if they choose so, to remain ignorant to the rest of the world, preferring to focus on the world within our borders. So a terrorist attack to them seemed to be out of context and sparked great fear. Most didn't understand why would anyone wish this upon us. The attack drew a swift reaction from the Bush administration, and his administration's actions were backed up overwhelmingly by members of both parties and the American public. The nation decided that the perpetrators behind the attack should be punished above all else, with considerations of global security, civilian safety, and engagement costs to be dealt with later.